Hello, my dears. Story 1. My sick grandmother is able to talk again using AI. She's saying unspeakable things. I'll never forget the night before my mom passed away. The entire family, mom, dad, grandma, my much younger 8-year-old brother Brian, and myself, had all gathered around the dinner table to celebrate the holidays, joking and laughing as we ate grandma's famous cookies, before heading to bed for the night. The next morning, Mom was gone. Brian took it the hardest. With my dad always at work and me being off at college, my brother naturally turned to the only family member who was home to support him, Grandma. She'd bake him her famous cookies, play games with him in the backyard, and read him bedtime stories at night. And, as a result, somehow, in the wake of Mom's death, Brian got better and returned to his happy and joyous self, basking in his time with his new, albeit older, parental figure. But just a year later, Grandma had a stroke, leaving her conscious but paralyzed in a wheelchair, unable to speak and barely able to move. Brian was once again inconsolable, sitting by Grandma's side in silence by day and crying himself to sleep at night. Sure, he had been profoundly hurt by the loss of our mother just a year prior, but losing Grandma, or at least the Grandma we knew, was somehow even worse. She was there, but not there at the same time, causing him to cling on to her in a way he simply hadn't with Mom. Seeking to fill the void of Brian's attachment with Grandma, Dad and I tried everything, from hiring a nanny to watch over him while we were away, to me even putting a pause on college for a while to be home with him. But no matter what we did, nothing worked. Day by day, he simply hung his head in sadness, sitting by Grandma's side and refusing to speak, as if in solidarity. Until one day, I read an article about an AI company specializing in a conversational experience designed to emulate that of a lost family member or lover. The concept was simple. Provide the company with as much information about the loved one as possible, and they create a chatbot custom-tailored to recreate their personality, capable of responding, engaging, and asking questions in the exact tone, style, and personality of said loved one. In our case, Grandma. Sure, it wasn't quite meant for someone like Grandma who hadn't actually passed away, but we were desperate to try anything to get Brian back to normal. So we mailed the company every recipe Grandma had ever come up with, every letter she had ever written, and every story she had ever told us, and waited. And sure enough, a couple weeks later, we received a confirmation email from the company. Congratulations, Grandma's chatbot is ready. Together as a family, Brian, Dad, and myself, along with Grandma in her wheelchair, signed into the chatbot on a tablet, placed it in Grandma's lap, and began talking with her. And sure enough, she came alive again. "Hey, Grandma, how old were you when you gave birth to Dad?" I asked. 29, the chatbot replied, in an eerily perfect recreation of Grandma's voice. "Hey, Grandma, what's your favorite movie?" My dad asked, attempting a trick question. "I hate movies," the chatbot replied, just as Grandma used to do. We all let out a laugh, including Brian, who, after previously being a bit hesitant, quietly walked up to Grandma and asked his own question. "Hey, Grandma, what's the secret to your cookie recipe?" "Nutmeg and a sprinkle of sea salt," she replied, again just as she always had. It brought a smile to Brian's face, causing Dad and myself to practically shed a tear. Brian continued to ask questions, and in just a week's time, my poor brother, who had been driven into depression after 2 back-to-back losses, had bounced back, once again returning to his happy self. It was as if Grandma was back, her relationship with Brian returning to business as usual, as she taught him how to bake her famous cookie recipe himself, talked to him while he played in the backyard, and read him bedtime stories at night. All through the voice of the chatbot, of course, while Grandma herself sat there in silence, enjoying Brian's return to normalcy, or so we hoped. But I couldn't help but feel a bit skeptical of the situation as we watched Grandma sitting there, an AI voice speaking on her behalf, while she herself, unable to speak, simply looked at us, her eyes moving around in silence. I couldn't help but wonder what she was actually thinking. But despite my hesitation, my dad insisted that everything was okay and, feeling a pressure to return to work and school respectively, My dad and I were left with no choice but to leave Brian home with Grandma, at least during the day. And for a while, all was well. Until months later, when it came time for us to go on our yearly family camping trip. Sure, our numbers had dwindled, but with the introduction of Grandma's chatbot, we had regained one more family member. So the four of us, Dad, Brian, Grandma, and I, set off in our camper and headed upstate for what was to be a week of relaxation, at the same spot by the river we always camped at. It had been a family tradition going all the way back to my dad's youth and was complete with a fire pit, treehouse, and old cabin. For the first couple days, things were normal as Grandma's chatbot filled the silence of Grandma's stroke, as she cheered Brian on as he baked her famous cookie recipe by the fire, called up to him while he played in the treehouse, and read him bedtime stories at night in the old cabin. But on the third day, something changed. When Dad and I got back from playing baseball by the river, we found Brian sitting by the fire pit, staring at a charred batch of cookies that were burning in the fire. "What happened here, bud?" My dad casually asked Brian. "Grandma told me to destroy them." "Why?" I asked. "Because she said I didn't cook them right." Dad and I didn't quite know what to make of it, so we simply both let out a nervous laugh. "She always was picky," my dad reasoned jokingly as he walked away. Later that day, while Brian was hanging out in the old treehouse, Grandma sitting there in her wheelchair below, I realized he had gone uncharacteristically quiet and decided to climb up its wooden ladder to investigate. Upon discovering my brother carving words into the walls of the treehouse, I asked, "What ya writing, bud?" But he didn't reply. He simply kept scratching away at its wooden walls with a rock. Again, I didn't quite know what to make of the bizarre behavior, so I simply ignored it. And then later that night, I overheard the weirdest thing yet. As Grandma's chatbot read Brian a bedtime story in the old cabin, I heard her read some of the sentences backwards. "That's odd," I whispered to myself, confused by the creepy-sounding rendition of the story. But the creepiest thing about it was the fact that Grandma herself lay asleep in her wheelchair as her AI voice read on. I thought to interrupt and let Brian know that something might be wrong with the chatbot's software, but he had already fallen asleep and looked so content in his slumbers that I decided to leave it alone and went to bed. The next day, things escalated. In the morning, we found Brian once again sitting by the fire, this time cooking something else in the fire. "That's no cookie," my dad said to me, his nose twitching, before we both ran over to inspect what my brother was roasting. Lo and behold, there was a burnt squirrel cooking away on a stick as Brian stared deep into the fire. But before we could say anything, my brother picked up the charred creature and began eating it as though it was a piece of corn on the cob. "Brian, what are you doing?" my dad yelled. My brother simply turned to him and said, "Having breakfast." "Why are you eating that of all things?" I asked in disgust. "Grandma told me to," he said, taking a bite before my dad ripped it out of his hand. "Brian," my dad and I cried out, scolding him in unison. We both looked over at Grandma, who simply stared back at us with wide eyes, before we turned our gaze to the tablet that was sitting on her lap. "Hey, Grandma, why'd you tell Brian to eat a squirrel?" I called out to the device. "Because it deserved it," the chatbot replied in Grandma's voice. "Maybe it's time we power off Grandma," my dad suggested as he attempted to reach for the tablet. But Brian hissed at us and snatched the device from Grandma's lap before Dad could grab it, more attached to Grandma than ever. Later that day, as my dad and I discussed whether we should turn off the chatbot for the rest of the trip, we were interrupted by yet another burning smell. This time, that of candles. We looked at each other, confused, before we raced to the source of the smell. The treehouse, where Grandma was once again sitting at its base. Upon climbing up to the treehouse, we found Brian sitting there in silence, his head down, holding a lit candle in each of his hands, the words he had carved into the tree littering its walls like a bizarre wallpaper. "What's wrong, Brian?" my dad asked. "Oh, nothing's wrong," he replied. "I'm just holding a service for Grandpa." But Grandpa already had a service when he passed away years back. "I know, But Grandma wasn't there for it. Yeah, she was Bud. Remember? She was sitting beside you. Yeah. But Grandma wasn't, he said, pointing down to the tablet in Grandma's lap, where the chatbot remained silent. Hey, Grandma. Dad called down to the device. Did you tell Brian to hold this service for Grandpa? Yes. The tablet speaker called out in Grandma's voice. Grandpa's soul is restless and asked for a sacrifice. A sacrifice? I asked aloud as my dad and I turned to each other, then back to the treehouse. That's when we saw it. A mangled bird, surrounded by more lit candles, its feathers scattered everywhere. My dad and I looked at each other in horror. Yeah, okay, no more chatbot, my dad said, before racing back down the ladder, running over to Grandma, and ripping the tablet from her lap before Brian could even think to stop him. Dad, stop, he screamed down from the treehouse. Leave Grandma alone. You're hurting her. But Dad ignored his pleas. Get rid of that animal. Get down here and be on your best behavior, and I'll consider letting Grandma read you a bedtime story tonight. Brian did just that, returning to normal and spending the rest of the day with us, careful to be on his best behavior. That night, true to his word, Dad wheeled Grandma over to Brian's bed in the old cabin, where the tablet began to read him a bedtime story before Dad retired to his own bed for the night. Meanwhile, I went for a walk by the river at night, where I would always go to look up at the stars, until suddenly, I heard my dad let out a loud scream in the distance. It was a horrifying sound, the likes of which I'd never heard from him, causing me to immediately run back to the old cabin to investigate. When I got there, I found Brian in Dad's bedroom, standing over a now bleeding Dad, who was mumbling, "Help!" before his eyes rolled back in his head and he went unconscious. "Brian!" I screamed. Hearing my cry, my brother turned back to me, holding a baseball bat, the same one my dad had been bringing up to the camp since he was a boy. "Brian, what have you done?" I yelled out. "Grandma told me Mommy missed Daddy," he explained before continuing. "So I was helping return Daddy to Mommy." I looked over at the tablet, which was sitting on Grandma's lap, before it chimed in. "Brian, Mommy misses your brother too. Now that you've returned Daddy to her, it's time you do the same to your brother." "Yes, Grandma," my brainwashed brother replied almost robotically, as if he was somehow connected to the sinister device. I looked at Grandma, as her eyes raced back and forth, clearly conscious of what was happening, but unable to move or speak. "Brian, no," I called out as he carried the baseball bat towards me. I took a step back, but before I could run away, I felt a pair of metal jaws clamp down on my leg, crunching the bone and trapping me there. "Arg!" I cried out in pain, as I looked down to discover a small metal animal trap that Brian must have left inside the old cabin for one of us. As I fell to the ground in pain, Brian walked closer and closer and closer, raising the baseball bat high above his head. Grandma's chatbot spoke again. "Do it, Brian. What are you waiting for? Kill him." Brian took a look at the tablet in Grandma's lap, then back at me, before preparing to strike down on me with the bat, as I lay there, helpless. But suddenly, I saw something move behind my brother. It was Grandma herself, having somehow willed herself to stand up, as she gripped onto the tablet. "Grandma?" I yelled out, shocked to see her standing. That's when Brian turned around to find Grandma holding the tablet high above her head, just as he had just done with his baseball bat. Knowing what she was about to do, Brian cried out, "No, Grandma, don't do it." But it was too late. In a matter of seconds, Grandma had smashed the tablet to bits on the floor of the old cabin, its glass surface shattering into 1,000 pieces, its electronic innards spilling out everywhere. My brother watched on in horror as he screamed again, "No." After Grandma finished destroying the device, having used every ounce of strength left in her body, she fell back into her wheelchair before saying 4 words. "Brian, I love you." My brother's face turned from a look of shock to one of utter happiness, and tears started rolling down his cheeks, as he realized his real grandma was back and snapped out of his trance. He ran over to hug her. "Grandma, I'm so sorry. Told me to do bad things. I thought it was you." Grandma tried to reply but was too exhausted. She simply patted him on the back as he hugged her, crying. Meanwhile, I rushed over to my dad and attempted to mend his wounds before carrying him off to the camper and driving him to the hospital, where he was treated for the next few weeks. Less than a month later, our family had gathered around the dinner table for the holidays, just as we always did. Grandma, having regained the ability to walk with a cane, sat by Brian and I at the table, while Dad, still recovering, sat beside us in the very same wheelchair that once belonged to Grandma. As we all finished eating, Dad turned to my brother and asked, "What's for dessert, Brian?" Brian shot Grandma a smile, who smiled back, and he ran to the kitchen, returning a minute later with a batch of her famous cookies. As we all sat there at the dinner table, eating the cookies, a light snow could be seen through the windows falling outside, and it finally felt as if life had returned to normal. Dad and I were careful not to bring up the incident at the camping trip, lest it trigger something in my brother again, and managed to avoid the topic the entire night until we all grew tired. "I'm sleepy," Brian said, as he stared at his phone. "I'm gonna go to bed." With that, he placed his phone on the dinner table and, forgetting it, headed upstairs to retire for the night. "Night, Bud," my dad said with a smile. "Night, Brian," I added with a smile of my own. Dad and I both looked over at Grandma who, instead of smiling along with us, had a concerned look on her face. "What is it, Grandma?" I asked. She waited a moment for Brian to disappear up the stairs, before pointing to something. Dad and I followed the direction of her finger to Brian's phone, which was still lying there, unlocked on the dinner table, its display still glowing. I carefully reached across the table to pick it up, expecting to find a game or digital comic, but instead, found the mobile version of Grandma's chatbot, with several characters typed into the login page's password field, and an error message that read, "Wrong password. Too many sign-in attempts. Try again in 24 hours." My eyes opened wide in horror as I realized that Brian had been trying to access Grandma's chatbot again. Luckily, we had never given him the password. "What is it?" my dad asked, seeing my adverse reaction. I simply slid the phone over to him, passing it by Grandma, who clearly already knew what was going on. Dad took one look at the phone screen before saying, "We better cancel the account. I'll do it tomorrow." I assured him, after recalling the correct password, and knowing that the sign-in lock wouldn't expire until then. My dad, Grandma, and I looked at each other before we all turned to the cookies and started to munch away on them nervously in silence, our minds all surely wondering if this was actually the end of Brian's allegiance to Grandma's AI chatbot, or only just the beginning. Story 2. I'll never work in a mall again. Going to work is unfortunately something none of us can avoid, and after everything that I've been remembering the past few nights, I might just join the military to avoid it. My name is Clara, for the record, and I will never work in a mall ever again. Going into my store every day came with its challenges. Most of them didn't begin until the customers started to pour in from the food court. But this day was special. This day was way different. I went, opened and closed the gate as normal, and clocked in on the main computer. I glanced over and saw that my store manager left a note for me. Kind of odd, but not entirely unusual considering its fill. I had worked in that store for over a year, and he still did not understand how to schedule. "I'm going out of town for the day for a company meeting. Kick butt today, and don't forget to go through and change out some of the displays." Phil, I sighed. That was his job, not mine. Another Philism for the books, I said aloud to myself. I completed the rest of my daily opening duties before I moved onto the extra stuff that Phil was pushing off onto me. I went over and grabbed the clothes pole so I could take down everything I had put up previously. Reaching the pole up in the air, I tried to hook onto the hanger. Of course it wasn't easy, it was never easy. I finally caught one and wrangled it off the post like a bear catching a salmon. I sighed again, realizing that I had nothing to hang this stuff on until I put it away. Small inconveniences make for big frustrations. I said aloud to myself again. I hated going to the back room alone. I walked into the back, singing a little song to myself like a child who's afraid of the dark. This was the dark and I am the child. I'll still admit it. I made my way to the back corner where the rolling racks were stored, and as I placed my hand on the cold metal of the bar, I realized that the lights that were normally motion sensitive hadn't turned on yet. You've got to be kidding me. I tried to pull the rack out of its cubby quicker after the gain of this knowledge. This would happen when I'm already scared. The rack stuck onto the wheels of the many other racks in the corner and refused to let go from its metallic friends. Forget it. I let go of the rack and hustled up to the motion sensor on the light. I stood there for a moment and started to flail my arms in the air rapidly to try and get it to turn on. Nothing worked, so I had no choice but to pull my phone flashlight out to solve the problem at hand. The electrical work could wait for another day. I walked back to the back corner of the room with the flashlight neatly tucked in the front of my jeans so that I had full use of my hands. As I bent down to grab a hold of the wheels in order to detangle the metal, I heard a small settling of something behind me. Not a metallic sound, but more of a piece of wet cloth dropping to the concrete ground. An alarm set off in my head. I began singing again. That was the only thing that seemed to calm me down, but I still wouldn't look behind me to see what it was. With a clang, the pieces of metal finally came undone and the rack finally came loose. I rolled it out of the room, specifically pointing my back towards the sound. As I led the rack back out into the storefront, I looked over to the fire exit door that led to a small courtyard outside. The door had a bright red bar across the handle to let you know the alarm will sound as soon as you walk out. That was normal. The door was closed as normal, however. There was one thing that was strange. There was no light coming through the peephole of the door. I rushed back out into the front of the store, panting from not only running but also just from the quick shock that I had gotten. I checked the clock. It's 11 a.m. Time to open up. An hour or so went by and there still had not been a single customer in my store. Actually, there have been like no customers besides the same groups of 2 or 3 elderly people fast walking around the mall corridors. The security guards and all the other workers are there as normal. I look out into the food court just to make sure. I stood in my entryway for a moment, being sure that I wasn't imagining things. It was indeed the same people over and over and over. 1, 2, 5, 6, 9, 10, 11, 13, 14, 16? That's it, I asked. After a few more minutes of standing behind the cash register, mulling that number 16 over in my head and glancing back into the doorway of the back room, I figured I should keep myself busy with the rest of the displays Phil told me to change. I picked the pole back up, put it into position, and returned to my routine. 10 minutes went by, still no customers, and I found myself leaning more into the music I had been playing than before, perhaps trying to keep my mind from thinking too much. 20 minutes went by, and as I was replacing the display at the top, I heard it. The exact thing that I was subconsciously afraid of. A voice. A small, faint voice. It sounded delighted in tone and seemed to only come out in a high-pitched squeal. This time, I did turn around, my whole body twisted toward the origin of the sound and, of course, nothing. Absolutely no one to be seen. I held my breath, then thought for a minute, and I exhaled again, thinking that maybe I was still wheezing from the cold I had prior. What do they call that? Grasping at straws? It took me a little bit to finally gain the courage to go back to the wall and continue the display. It was 3 p.m. by the time I finally decided to finish it. We closed at 7 p.m. I walked back over, pole in my hand, and I began putting clothes up and taking clothes down, even getting sucked into the puzzle of shelving for a little bit. Seemingly, everything weird had stopped happening and I could finally focus on this damn display. Still, no customers. I went out to the food court again, 16. Bending down, I retrieved the last shelf from the floor and put it into place, looking underneath as I lined the pegs up with the holes in the shelf. Standing back up and taking a step back by a shirt rounder, I appreciated what I had just achieved and metaphorically and physically pat myself on the back. I walked back in front of the wall and grabbed the pole from the shelf I had leaned it up on. As I reached for the pole, I felt on the back of my shirt, a reach for me. A small wave of a grasp that wasn't entirely successful. I gasped, without thinking, and spun around for a second time. Within this motion, I heard another small voice, a laugh this time, a chuckle. It seemed too human to be what I saw in that moment. Peeking through the gap in the shirts, a young girl smiled up at me. She seemed to be around 7 years old, but with extremely aging wrinkles around the sides of her eyes and deeply dark bags beneath them. Dirt caking the teeth that were looming out from behind her dry, cracked lips. Sat in a stout crouch in the middle of the rounder. She held her arms out to me as if to give me a hug. The smell that permeated from her underarms as she raised them to me was a stench I could never forget. It still lingers in my nose. The smell of death, disease, and of matter decaying with every breath she took. Tissue sloughing off her cheeks as she smiled at me. I stepped back. She smiled again, put her arms back down by her side, and ran off into the back room of my store. I called Phil. August 28th, 5:30 p.m. Phil has done nothing but laugh at me, so I'm leaving. This is the one thing I'm writing down in order to try to get everything out into the open. I'm done with the store and whatever it has to offer. I'm doing exactly what everyone in the movies doesn't do but should. He can laugh all he wants. I am not dealing with that. I'm calling security. Sergeant Stintz came to my rescue at that moment. Stintz was a small, round, and slightly uptight older man. Many people in the mall hated him because of that, but I always chalked it up to it being because he was bald. I told him about the peephole and the weird sounds. I even told him about the girl woman and how there hadn't been more than 16 people in the food court all day, him included. I asked him to go to the other side of the mall and find out more information. I didn't know what else to do. I closed the store gate at 6:30 p.m., which gave me some time to go around to other stores and see if they experienced anything strange, besides, of course, the lack of new customers. I walked up to all 3 restaurants in the food court and they all gave me the same vacant smile, blank and soulless eye contact, and they all seemed to follow the same script. Thank you for coming. Have a nice day. With a closing dirt-covered smile, before turning away, dropping the smile to an almost melancholy frown and getting back to their tasks. I went to the stores next door to my own, hoping that there would be some sort of normalcy there. We had become pretty friendly due to being so close to each other. I walked into the first store, and at first I didn't see anyone at all, not a single soul. I thought maybe they had closed their store as well. Maybe they also thought some weird stuff was going on. But everything else was normal. Music going, cash registers still logged into Catherine. No manager would leave their store like this. I walked around for a minute and noticed nothing else of substance and decided to go to the store on the other side of mine. I finally saw people again. I replayed in my head, please be real, whatever that meant. I had no idea. I walked up to Megan, a longtime manager of the store. She was bent over putting away displays of lamps and their boxes. I said her name, faintly but loud enough for her to hear, to no avail. I decided to tap her on the shoulder. Megan turned around, as her body rotated towards me. I could see the beginning of what was a smile, muddy teeth careening from her face, and lips pinned back to her ears with passionate glee. The same dark wrinkles and bags that were apparent on the girl were apparent on Megan. I jumped back. Thank you for coming. Have a nice day. She turned back around and continued to do her task. As Megan, or this other form of Megan, continued back to her duty, a sharp screech came from what sounded like the back room of Megan's store. I will say though, if it's anything like my back room, I wanted very little to do with it. I headed back there anyway. As I started sprinting towards the back of Megan's store, I could hear her putting all of the boxes down, and slowly footsteps began to follow me to the back. Excuse me, that area is for employees only. Please make your way to the exit. Anger grew in Megan's voice each time she repeated the phrase. I made my way to the back room. Unlike my back room, there's had a door. Without looking back or even thinking twice, I slammed the door shut and pushed anything I could find in front of it. She didn't stop following me, although her actions didn't become hostile either. Only her words grew with anger. She politely knocked on the door, and after a while, She stopped talking and just knocked on the door. I turned around, feeling secure in the room that I was trapped in. I walked into the room more and quickly found that there was a staircase leading up to another level of the room. A scream pierced the air again, and this time I was solidified in my answer by going up there. I made it to the top of the staircase and walked down a long, slender and dimly lit hallway. One door was visible to me at the very end, a flicker of light blinking underneath the door as if to invite me in. Another scream was cast through the air. The door was completely shut when I walked up to it. I tried to slowly open the doorknob, but it let out a terrifying moan. I froze and looked around me, hoping no one would be led to my area. I peered into the room after a minute or two and saw Sarah, Megan's employee, tied up to the boiler in the corner of the room, slashes and cuts smeared across her chest. Her shirt barely hung off her shoulders due to the trauma cast upon her. She was turned away from me, her face pressed up against the wall. I whispered her name. She turned her head towards me, and as she did, there were two purple, swollen sockets where her eyes should have been. Sarah. Clara? You should not be here. She shakes her head. Somehow her eyes were still able to cry. Clara. I'm here to help you. Hold still so I can get the rope off. I moved closer to her, trying to get my hands on the knot of the rope. She started to squirm. Clara, I know you're scared, Sarah. I'm sorry. I promise I'm not one of them, okay? She stopped moving, her head slowly moved up to look at me, still making eye contact. Sarah. One of who? Clara. What do you mean? Clara. I mean one of these fucks who hurt you, okay? I'm not going to hurt you. I reached out to untie her again. She pulled from me. Sarah. How do I know that? How do I know they didn't do that to you too? Clara. Sarah, please. I'm begging you. Let me get you out of here. Sarah. Don't touch me, you freak. You are one of those things that did this. You are. She started laughing now, not a humorous laugh, more of a laugh someone expels when they've truly given up. As Sarah laughed, I began to hear footsteps down the hallway and a faint, "Thank you for coming. Have a nice day," echoing into the room. I scooched back, trying to push my back up against the wall as tight as I could so maybe they wouldn't see me behind the door. There was no other place to hide. They swung the door open, luckily not closing it behind them. "Thank you for coming. Have a nice day," they said as they entered the room. It was two men, one that worked at the shoe store on the other side of the mall and the other was wearing a mask. Another "Thank you for coming. Have a nice day" was expelled from the mall employee, and an uncommon "Up you go" came from the other. I let out a slight gasp when I heard this. They stood Sarah up on her feet, her legs were barely able to hold her weight. The two men spun her around and the masked man plunged an elbow into the middle of her back, forcing her to stand up straight. I gasped again. I watched as the masked man grabbed Sarah's face by the chin, turned her to face him and spit in her swollen face. Masked man. That's what you get for trying to get in my way. He smacked her across the face. His spit flew off of her lips as he hit her. And that's for just being a bitch. Mark. Thank you for coming. Have a nice day, the mall employee. Mark, I think his name was, followed suit with spit to Sarah's face, followed by a deep smack. The smile never left his wrinkled and deformed face. Masked man. I found your stash, sweetheart. I don't know how you thought you could do this to me. Really? I mean, it's kind of biological if you think about it. Even without seeing me, you can tell that men are inherently stronger than women. It's just science, babe. He shrugged and pulled out a large butcher's knife from the waist of his pants. I kind of feel like a real-life villain right now. Haha, this is one of a kind. Truly, thank you for making this possible. He grabbed Sarah's face again and made her turn towards him, this time kissing her. She tried to pull away, but his grip was too tight along her jawline. Masked man, see? I told you I'm just stronger. With the last word leaving his lips, he plunged the knife into the top of Sarah's kneecap and sliced clockwise, nearly exposing bone. If you really think you're strong, prove it to me. Another laugh expelled from his chest as he completed the circle around Sarah's knee, now showing bone. I began to feel sick, My stomach turned and twisted like I was the one being cut. I felt the pain in my legs and even in my chest. It was nothing I had ever felt before. The masked man finished the job on the other leg, but that's what I gathered from Sarah's cries of horror. I couldn't bring myself to look at her. Masked man. Now, sweet, sweet Sarah, what is one thing you need from me before I leave you be? Sarah, who are you? And why can you talk to me when the others can't? She asked through her sobs and pain. I still couldn't look at her. Masked man, he laughs. Ah, my dear child, if I told you that, I'd have to kill you. Ha ha ha. I saw his mask be cast aside in front of the door. There was a brief pause. Oh, ha ha. I guess that didn't help you, huh? He bursted out into laughter, just barely cut off by Sarah. Sarah. I said, who the fuck are you? Her screams were louder now, as if she had tried to move towards him. Masked man. Well, if you insist. He shrugged. He raised the knife and slammed it down through the floorboard, assumingly pinning Sarah to it. I heard the crash of the wood and the bellowing cries of Sarah as he laughed again. I'm surprised you can't tell by the sound of my voice. I mean, with how long we worked together. Stints, you fucking dunce. Night-night, sweet Sarah. I started to peek back around the door when I heard another slam of something into the floorboards. Sarah's once full and wholehearted screams were now nothing more than weak whimpers. Footsteps let out. Sarah went silent, as did the room. I still didn't want to believe what I just heard. Stints? So, was he looking for me now too? Sarah, poor fucking Sarah. Damn it. I could have stopped him. I could have done anything. Although I wasn't quite sure if she was worth giving my life for. What am I saying? This is sick. I left the room and made my way back down the stairs and into the original back room. I see that this store also had a fire exit door in the back. I let myself out. Unlike our store, this back door led to a small corridor that connected the different major parts of the building. Not outside. Why couldn't it have led outside? The lights were incredibly dim, a pale yellow. The walls were a grimy eggshell color and the floors were concrete. My footsteps echoed as I made my way through, unsure as to where this corridor would lead me. I saw a large double metal door at the end of the hall. The crack between the door, dark, however, no light could be seen. As I made my way towards the double doors, I began to smell a sweet but sour smell coming from the door left of the double doors. It should have been what led to one of the few restaurants within the food court. It said so on the door. I turned, suddenly losing my objective out of pure curiosity, the same thing that killed the cat. I grabbed the handle to the door, took a deep breath and pulled. The smell wafted towards me as I opened the door. It was truly petrifying. As the smell of what could only be described as rotten flesh hit me in the face, 2 restaurant workers were laid out, still in front of me. A dirty smile creeped across their faces as my eyes glanced over them, dissipating as I closed the door. I turned away, not truly capturing what happened, and made my way towards the double doors once more, the smell of rot still in my nose. With everything that had happened so far, I had no idea how to even process what was happening at this point. I pushed through the second set of doors, instinctively putting on the ear-to-ear grin, wiping it off then putting it back on. What was I doing? This was probably how everyone in there became one of those things. I know this now and can even justify it as trying to blend in. There was no one there. I looked both ways and noticed, still no one there. I saw the exit, the one thing that I could actually focus on. I checked left and right one more time, no one, and made a break for it. I reached the doors. Stints. Where do you think you're headed, lady? I listened but didn't let him influence my decision. I was getting out of there. I grabbed the door handle and got into the passageway before actually stepping outside. I went to grab the other door handle. Stints. I asked you, where are you going? He grabbed me by the collar of my shirt and raised me into the air. He turned to make me face him and spit in my face. Much like he did Sarah, he was going to kill me. He took me back inside the mall, this time locking the exit doors, and threw me over the counter of a food court restaurant, landing me upon the 2 previously executed workers. I searched around me for anything that I could possibly find to stop him. I thought about what he had said to Sarah and how I couldn't be the one to prove him right. I tried to stumble to my feet as I felt a gaze on the back of my head. I managed to get to my knees before looking up and met the eye line of not just Mark and Stintz but the girl woman, Megan, and the 4 other food court employees I had seen prior in the day. All peeked at me from over the counter. Their wrinkled and decrepit fingers snuck over the edge of the table. Their fingernails chipped and shattered away as they gripped the wood. Stintz came from around the counter, through the side doors, and knelt beside me. "Stintz, do you understand what's going on here yet?" He tapped the same knife he used to kill Sarah on the tile next to me. "We here want to run a smooth and tight-knit community of hard-working employees, Miss Clara. And you, Sarah, and a few others, as you can see." He took the knife and poked at the bodies below me as if it were a dead animal. "Don't really fit the bill. They, however, are perfect for the gig." He gestured behind him to the gaggle of degenerates that were caressing the counter. "You do have to understand that we must let go of you now, right? No hard feelings." He chuckled and looked at me deep in my eyes. I should have gotten up and ran right then, but it was almost like he had me in a trance of some sort. After what felt like hours, I finally gained the courage to stand and run. I dashed past Stintz through the side doors of the restaurant, feeling a sharp pain on my scalp as I got slightly past him. I was face to face with him again, with a fistful of my hair being the only thing giving him power over me. Before I knew it, I began to cry. I didn't want to show him my weakness, nor did I want him to have any more power over me than he already did. But it couldn't be stopped. "Stintz, there, sweet Clara. No need to cry. It is just a job after all, no need to fret." He wiped a tear from my face and lifted my chin to look at him. "Smile for me, will you?" he said, soft and arguably sincere. I did. "Thank you," he said. I closed my eyes as I smiled at him, feeling the tears start to dissipate. An electric ache shot through the side of my face as I sat with my eyes closed. I couldn't place exactly where the pain was coming from, but I knew then that that wouldn't be the end of the pain. Another twinge of pain shot up from my hands, left then right. I was dropped to the ground again. A cacophony of "thank you for coming, have a nice day" erupted as I grasped at the cold tile beneath me, feeling blood rush from my palms. It all went black. I woke up, felt my legs being grasped and dragged as my head bounced off the concrete ground. I looked around to see myself within the backrooms of the mall. I looked up to see who was in control of me, and I couldn't make out who it was in front of me. Maybe due to my eyesight still being blurry from the pain, or due to the multitude of concussions I'd gained through my journey on the ground. "Hello," I managed to say. Without looking at me, the voice replied, shaky yet strong. "Are you okay, Clara? I don't know what the fuck is happening here, but I'm really glad I decided to come in." It was Phil. "I appreciate your help, but I can walk," I said, feeling his hands let go of my ankles. "Shit, sorry. I didn't know how else to do that." As I stood to my feet, Phil grabbed my hand and dragged me out the emergency exit. It led to the same courtyard our exit led into. Phil still didn't let go. Instead, he dragged me to his car, parked in the farthest corner from the mall, and shoved me in through the passenger side door. "We're going to the hospital," he said. It all went black again. I woke up again, this time in a hospital room. I heard the beeps and buzzes from around me and saw the wires attached to every limb. No one here but Phil. "What did you tell them?" I asked, afraid of him telling them the truth, but just as terrified of him not saying anything at all.
"À car accident,"
he replied. "I told them I found you on the side of the road on my way home from work, and here we are." I sighed, as did he. My dinner came. I've been awake now for about 3 days, and I can't get the sight of my palms or the pain I felt out of my head. The smiles and sounds I had been tormented with the whole time will now be infecting my every move forever. I hate thinking about the fact that they're there while I'm writing this today. Story 3. Halloween was my favorite holiday growing up. Now, I absolutely hate it. Child abuse, I won't sugarcoat it. I hate Halloween. The cool weather, the creepy decorations, The sound of children giggling as they bounce down the sidewalk. I can't stand it. I know that makes me sound like a Grinch, but hear me out. I have a good reason. As a child, Halloween was my favorite holiday. Yeah, Christmas was great and all, but there was just something different about spooky season that really hit home with me. Well, until I turned 11, that is. That was the year that something truly heinous happened. Something that turned my favorite holiday into the most dreaded day of the year. Your costume looks great, kiddo. You're supposed to be a Power Ranger, right? Uncle Ricky asked, taking a sip from his cider. I frowned. No, I'm Raphael. Uncle Ricky's brows furrowed. From Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. He stared at me blankly. I could practically see the cogs trying and failing to turn in his head. You know what? Whatever it is, it looks great. Fantastic job, buddy. He ruffled my hair before draining the remainder of his cider. I took a step back, staring at the ground. Guess what my dash ding? The sound of the doorbell cut him off mid-sentence. That's probably Chris. See you later, Uncle Ricky. I raced to the door and flung it open to find Captain America standing before me. Chris's costume was detailed. From the suit to the cape to the shield, he had it all. His parents must have spent a pretty penny on it. Come on, Chris, let's go, I said, ushering him down the driveway. We'd made it about halfway down when Uncle Ricky appeared at the door. You boys be safe now. Wouldn't want anything to happen to ya. I shuddered. Something about the way he said that made me uneasy. We will be, I shouted back, still speed-walking away. Hey man, what gives? Why are we walking so fast? Chris demanded once we'd reached the sidewalk. It's Uncle Ricky. I don't like being around him. He's weird. Like, what kind of weird? I shifted my gaze to the plastic pumpkin bucket swinging back and forth in my hand. I dunno. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Okay? Fine. Let's hit that house first. I heard they give out king-size chocolate bars. Chris and I trick-or-treated until well past sundown. To my dismay, even though I wore a turtle shell backpack and a red bandana, most people automatically assumed that I was the Hulk. Eventually, I just stopped correcting them. By 9 o'clock, all the other kids had already gone home, and I was getting tired of people thinking that I was Chris's sidekick. This is getting heavy. Are you ready to go back yet? I asked. Come on, just one more house. Then we'll dash. Hey boys, nice costumes you got there. We froze. I didn't know why, but my heart began to thunder in my chest at the sound of the man's voice. We slowly turned to face him. What I saw still sends chills down my spine to this day. A tall figure stood before us. He wore a leather jacket and jeans, and a red-splattered hockey mask shrouded his face from view. Even through the thin plastic, I could hear his ragged breathing, the shallow rise and fall of his chest as he stood there, that predatory stare boring into me. But that's not what frightened me the most. The man was holding a machete, one that was dripping with a dark crimson liquid. Chris and I didn't even say anything to each other. We didn't need to. We took off into a dead sprint, booking it down the sidewalk. I didn't have to look back to know that the man was in hot pursuit. My legs pumped as fast as they could go, and I tried my hardest to focus on getting to safety, but I couldn't shake this nagging feeling at the back of my head. The feeling that if I didn't do something, that Halloween would be my last. Help! Help us! I shrieked, praying that someone would come to our rescue, but no one did. The streets were empty, completely devoid of life. If anyone had heard my cries from inside their homes, they could have fooled me. Everyone probably thought it was just some dumb teenager pulling a Halloween prank. Little did they know, Chris and I were running for our lives. After what felt like an eternity, curiosity got the better of me, and I chanced to look back at our pursuer. My stomach instantly twisted into knots. He was gaining on us. Adrenaline took over, and I racked my brain for ideas. My candy bucket. I'd worked all night collecting my bounty, but in that moment, I didn't care. I just wanted to make it home in one piece. I hurled the plastic pumpkin behind me with as much strength as I could muster. I watched as it ricocheted off the man's arm and landed on someone's lawn, spilling its contents into their grass. My heart sank. I was out of ideas. "This way!" Chris yelled, pointing down a side street. My face lit up. We were still out of earshot at that distance, but I could see a woman and a young child walking along the sidewalk further ahead of us. With how far we'd strayed from our houses, she was the only chance we had at escaping from that lunatic. Just when I thought that we might make it out of there alive, the unthinkable happened. I tripped. Time seemed to slow as I went sprawling to the unforgiving concrete. I landed hard, scraping both of my knees in the process. I wailed in agony as tears blurred my vision. I was so dazed from the fall that I had almost completely forgotten about the predicament I was in, until I heard the man's labored breathing hovering directly above me. I suddenly felt someone grab my arm and shove me onto my butt. I have never been more terrified than I was in that moment. The fear was so overwhelming that I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could barely even breathe. My assailant didn't waste his opportunity. He dropped to his knees and began crawling toward me on all fours like an animal. The machete dragged along the sidewalk, its sharp, crimson-coated blade clinking against the concrete as he advanced. My breath hitched in my throat as the man loomed over me, mere inches from my face. His dark, soulless eyes stared into mine. He leaned in so close that I could smell his breath. Then, to my horror, he brought the machete up to my neck. My mind raced as he lightly slid it across my throat. My entire body trembled when he placed his fingers to the fresh wound and dipped them into the blood seeping from within. I watched, feeling as if the world was crumbling around me, as the man reached underneath the hockey mask and plunged his fingers into his mouth. "You taste incredible," he whispered, raising the machete again. My eyes grew wide as dinner plates, but this time for a different reason. In the blink of an eye, the man was lying on the ground with a rivulet of red seeping from his scalp. Chris tossed a brick to the ground beside him and pulled me to my feet. I had never been so happy to see him in my entire life. "Snap out of it. We have to go," Chris shouted, tugging me down the street. I glanced at the man one more time before we took off. That scene is one that will be burned into my brain for as long as I live. Once we made it back to my house, I snapped. I cried uncontrollably for hours, and nothing could get me to calm down. Of course, the cops were called, but the man had vanished by the time they arrived at the scene. I was inconsolable for weeks afterward, and not just because of what happened to me. When I glanced back that one final time, my attacker's mask had slipped, revealing part of his face. The image of my uncle lying there, still gripping the machete, is one that I will never forget. Uncle Ricky disappeared after that night. For reasons I can't explain, I never told my parents that he was the one chasing me. I don't know if they ever made the connection, but I didn't plan on bringing it up. My own memories of the event are painful enough, and I didn't want to relive that trauma. But now I think I've changed my mind, because yesterday, as I was returning from the pumpkin patch with my wife and daughter, I noticed something lying on a chair on our porch. My blood instantly ran cold when I saw it. A machete, a hockey mask, and a photo were neatly arranged on the cushion. My hands shook as I rummaged through them. When I picked up the picture and held it up to my face, all the awful events from that night came flooding back. The photograph depicted my daughter playing in our front yard. And on the back, written in crimson, was a note that said, "I really hope she tastes as incredible as you did."